Were groups of young Jewish European students and some Israeli students, a couple of North Americans. We went as sort of an entourage to confront Mr. Ahmadinejad. This is where Ahmadinejad was the only world leader to show up at this United Nations conference where he preached his, and I'm using my word very clearly and carefully, his genocidal anti-Semitism and his sexism and homophobia and the like. And it was actually an amazing, I think, moment in history. I think actually a spark was created in Geneva, where young Jewish students were joined by many Rwandans, people from Darfur, North Africans, a lot of Berbers, dissidents from Iran and Iraq, women's groups, gay groups. It was a whole sort of coalition of people who I think literally bumped into each other in the halls and realized that there is a common cause to confront radical Islam. And I've told the story before, but after I participated on a panel which was entitled Genocide, Racism, the Road to Genocide, in which I was speaking about incitement to genocide. There was somebody from Darfur speaking about the ongoing genocide, and somebody from Rwanda speaking about, it was the 15th anniversary of the genocide in Rwanda. And I remember after the lecture, Cynthia and her colleagues from the Rwandan mission invited me to speak and to have coffee. And one of the messages that was very profound for me was that many people in the mission were saying to me, you know, don't the Jews in the United States, don't Americans understand what is going on? That the dehumanization of Israelis, of Zionists, of Jews in the Middle East, and the sort of the narrative of Mr. Ahmadinejad is exactly what happened in Rwanda leading up to the genocide. And the people from the mission were imploring me to tell American Jews and scholars and intellectuals to wake up, that this level of dehumanization is something that they witnessed in Rwanda, and it's extraordinarily dangerous. So the concern and the solidarity that Cynthia and her colleagues I guess imparted to me was heartfelt and I think important. And there's a lot of cooperation by people in Rwanda to the history of the Holocaust, the Shoah, and also to the Israeli situation. So it's nice to welcome a friend. So Cynthia is going to speak today. The title of her talk is Genocide and the Assault on Memory, the Case of Rwanda. Cynthia Kamakazi is the Multilateral Officer for the Permanent Mission of Rwanda to the United Nations in Geneva. She's also a PhD student at the School of Geneva in Diplomacy and the Berkeley University campus in Geneva in international relations, and she's a specialist on international law. She got her first degree, her BA, from Luther College in Iowa, where she was a triple major in psychology, business, and French literature. She went on to do a master's at the University of Essex in the UK in issues of human rights and theory and practice of human rights. She has a wide history. I can go on for a long time about her participation in NGOs and human rights internationally. For example, in 2007, she was the United Nations Human Rights Accountability Project Coordinator for the Office of International Affairs. In 2006-07, she was a research and translation assistant for Christian Aid in London. She worked with African Pulse, which is a research and fundraising organization in London, and the list goes on. So it's really an honor that you're here, and welcome.
Thank you all. I'm really happy and honored to stand here and share with you some thoughts and experiences and observations on the genocide committed against the Tutsi in Rwanda and the current trends of it. I'm very honored for being invited and to be able to speak to you about what is happening and what we have made our campaign or our work to raise awareness about the current trends of genocide. So there is an old Rwandan saying that goes like, at the end of the day, after all of his good works in Rwanda and elsewhere, God comes home to Rwanda to sleep, as it is the most beautiful place in the world. And this is the truth. This land of 1,000 hills and valleys is for me the most beautiful place on earth, but yet at some point in time it became the blood-drenched land of a million atrocities. December of last year, around the world, we commemorated the 60th anniversary of the Convention on Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. A few months after, in April of 2009, for Rwandan people and all their friends, we marked the 15th anniversary of genocide committed against the Tutsi in Rwanda. On both occasions, we remember not only those victims who needlessly lost their lives, or the gallant men and women who fought and lost their lives so that we, all of us here, may live on. But we are also gathered here on this day in praise of all those who stood firm in their resolve, in the pursuit of civil sanity and justice, and who lived to tell the world what they saw. There is a short Nigerian proverb of the Yoruba people which states that if you go to a place that no one has ever been to before, you will see what no man has ever seen before. And in the Rwanda of 1994, those who have lived, the victorious, the vanquished, and even the visitor, have all been to that place that no one has ever been to before, and have seen what no man has ever seen before. The place of which I speak in time and space is none other than the genocide of 1994, the genocide committed against the Tutsi in Rwanda. Genocide is that place that exists at the final limit of destructive human experience. And with these experiences shared and the lesson learned, this event, this place in time marks a turning point, not only in the history of Rwanda, but also in history of all mankind. It is therefore we, all of us here, alongside all those who have been to that place, who are now duty-bound for the sake of our children and our children's children, duty-bound to keep alive an unmodified factual account of the events of genocide committed against the Tutsi without so much of it of revision or negation. Today, ladies and gentlemen, is a resounding trumpet call for all those who have seen or heard of that place, the place at the limit of human experience, to speak out, to speak always, and most of all, to speak truthfully. The story of genocide is as old as the history of organized power, if not as time itself. But of the 20th century, it begins in Africa, in the arid desert sands of Omahake, what we call today the Kalahari of Namibia, and it ends in Africa, amidst the lush green hills and valleys of Rwanda. And as if this was not enough, of the 21st century, it begins in Africa yet again, in another desert, this time in the arid desert sand of Darfur in Sudan. Genocide, as defined by the United Nations in the 1948 Convention, is a crime against humanity, and it is taken to mean acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious groups. And these acts include killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to the members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction, imposing measures intended to prevent birth within this group, or forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. Indeed, genocide is one of the deepest problems of human thought. The management of genocide should therefore call for the very best efforts of human reflection and human endeavor. and in so doing, no story must go untold. No one, not one person, victor, vanquished, or visitor, who has been to that place, the place on the very fringe of humanity, not one of them should ever remain silent about the truth. A French critic and journalist and novelist, Jean-Baptiste Descartes, described well the irony of life when he said, "Plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. More things change, the more they stay the same." And what has not changed through all the ages are the 8 stages of genocide. These stages were articulated by Gregory Stanton in his address to the US Department in 1996. He rationalized that genocide was a process that developed in 8 overlapping stages, which he named classification, symbolization, dehumanization, organization, polarization, preparation, extermination, and denial. Each of these stages is predictable, progressive, and stoppable. The later stages must be preceded by the earlier stages. Though earlier stages continue to operate throughout the process such that by the end of the mnemonic dramatic mixture, all simultaneous stages unfolds in unison. Today, ladies and gentlemen, in addition of these stages, I would like to introduce you to Dr. Ian Paul Auluch, preliminary stage of genocide, which he called the pretext. In the pretext stage, man, in his spiritual, greedy, simplistic stage of mind, goes about his daily businesses, encountering both pleasures and prejudices with ease and familiarity. Many of the utterances heard and prejudices felt during the fever pitch of genocide are the same words uttered and prejudices expressed during common civil disharmony. It's during this preliminary phase that the negative emotions of population are fomented, harnessed, and then galvanized. I will attempt to give you a common pretext. If those people go away, back to where they came from, then our problems will be solved and we will live in a peace and harmony as brothers and sisters in our land where the rivers will turn to milk, the rain into honey, and where all the streets will soon be paved with gold. How often all of us, inside and outside Rwanda, heard these very same utterances in our own spheres of life. In the case of Rwanda, it was for Tutsis to return to Chad, Egypt, Ethiopia, or biblical Mesopotamia, or whatever it was that Hutu were made to believe the Tutsi had come from. The atmosphere in Rwanda was widespread with embellished rumors of past atrocities supposedly committed by the Tutsi, and of the past subservient war and subhuman status that the Hutu were supposedly forced to endure against their will, and would endure again if the Tutsi were ever to return to political power. The first of the Gregory Stanton 8 stages of genocide is classification. Genocidal classification is the classification of people into us and them, by ethnicity, race, religion, or nationality. In this case, it was to be classification by ethnicity into Hutu, Tutsi, and Kwa. Such classification and identification was formally introduced during the Belgian colonial era and integrated into the structure of national identity document issued to all citizens of Rwanda, starting from 1962. I remember as a young girl of age 5 being asked by my teacher what ethnic group I belonged to, and I responded with pride, the only answer I knew, I'm Rwandan. I then got the beating of my life and was told to leave the classroom and come back only when I knew what I was. This system forced all persons to be affiliated with one or other group of the government-defined groups. It goes without saying that during the time of crisis, this form of classification and identification greatly facilitated the targeting of persons on the basis of group affiliation, making all Tutsi readily identifiable for marginalization, oppression, and subsequent extermination. In the next stage, the stage of symbolization, the characteristics of the target group were defined. Targeted Rwandan nationals were preferentially referred to as being Tutsi, as opposed to being called Rwandan, and were distinguished by their physical appearances. A typical Tutsi was described and identified as being tall, thin, with a long neck and a long nose. Anyone who fitted this description was a potential target, Tutsi or non-Tutsi. Classification and symbolization was universally human and do not necessarily result in progress towards genocide unless they lead to the next stage, dehumanization. Dehumanization is the stage during which one group denies the humanity of the other group. Members of the victim group are typically equated with animals, vermin, insects, and diseases. Stanton hypothesizes that dehumanization helps perpetrators to overcome the normal human disgust against murder. In Rwanda, it was the order of the day for the Tutsi to be referred to as cockroaches, inyenzi in our native language, Kinyarwanda. At this stage, hate propaganda in print and hate radio, such as Radio Mekoli, was used to vilify the Tutsi and fire up the predominantly Hutu masses into an emotionally energized mob. A mob that would soon need leadership, organization to harness and channel its pulsating energy and bring us to the next phase of our liberation, that of organization. The organization of genocide in Rwanda, as it has been on all genocides throughout history, was achieved with the support of states. In Rwanda, the state machinery used militia to provide operational genocidal functions, thereby facilitating the option of future deniability of state involvement. Through the years preceding 1994, special army units and militia were trained and armed, the most notorious of which were the Interahamwe and the Mpuzamigambi. Sometimes organization was informal and decentralized in the form of inspired neighborhood watch groups or institutional gangs. Plans were made for the genocidal killing, some of which necessitated the purchase and stockpiling of all manners of weapons. It is no secret that the arms trade is a multi-billion-dollar, inherently dirty global trade. With this in mind, the Rwandan government at the time had no difficulty selling to the world the idea that they were not the aggressor, that, in fact, they were the ones under attack and needed to defend the country against the terrorist group within its border, whose Uganda-based counterparts were soon to invade the sovereign space of the Republic of Rwanda. Given the state of affairs at this time, this was indeed a plausible and perhaps justifiable reason for anyone with either a limited or biased knowledge of the country to comply. Numerous countries near and far, likely and unlikely, easy to name but not diplomatic to name, along with numerous companies, listened to the call and complied. The stage was now set for all to proclaim their loyalty or else. This was the tone that characterized the stage of polarization. Polarization by way of Hutu extremist doctrines and practices drove Rwanda's society apart, polarizing the society and all men of color therein into Hutu and Tutsi and nothing else. The primary enemy, the Tutsi, was defined and described, and any other person or groups of person known or thought to be sympathetic to or remotely resembling a Tutsi was upgraded to the status of a potential enemy. If you were an African American living in Rwanda at the time, now was the time to leave, and quickly. Hate groups intensified their broadcast of polarizing propaganda over the radio and public gatherings in schools and colleges and churches. Intermarriage or social interaction was taboo. Extremists targeted and terrorized moderate Hutus, intimidating and silencing them, giving them a clear choice. You are either with us or against us. Moderate Hutu from within the perpetrators' own group were numerous and influential, and therefore the most likely and most able to stop the evolution of the genocide. The elimination of influential moderate Hutu was therefore a strategic security priority, and indeed they were to become amongst the first to be arrested, tortured, and executed. Then came the preparations. The preparation took place nationwide, and the fabric of society was rearranged to become more vulnerable to assault. In Rwanda, terror and chaos was the modus operandi of this preparatory phase. Death lists were drawn up and disseminated throughout the country as open secrets. All Tutsi families, mine included, were aware of being on the list, but none truly believed that this will actually take place with the UN around. Sporadic rape, killings, and expropriation of property were used to drive a clear message home. Terrified nationals fled the unprotected confines of the home. The rural and urban society spontaneously segregated and concentrated into open fields, schools, churches, hotels, and stadia. These became the de facto concentration camps. Within these confines, victims were identified and separated out on the basis of their ethnic identity, perceived identity, or complicity with the Tutsi, and were dealt with. The extermination, which by the way was already in process, escalated in the night of the 6th of April 1994 and quickly became the mass killing legally called genocide. The spark that ignited the genocidal inferno was the sudden death of former President Habyarimana in a plane crash in the same night. It remained explanation to the killers because in their frantic state, they did not regard the victim to be fully human, preferring to refer to the Tutsi as cockroaches, inyenzi. These killings were generally referred to as work or clearing the bush. At the time, it was common to hear on the radio sentences such as 12 Tutsis in X neighborhood were killed today. We have done good work. Or a Y person in a Y neighborhood is still not being found, so we still have work to do, as we haven't found the bodies of these major cockroaches. Because of this because it was sponsored by the state, the armed forces often worked hand in hand with militia to do the killings. The pretext that we referred to before is applicable and very relevant at this stage as well. What then transpired in Rwanda is best described and can only be described by those who were at that place, the abyss on the very fringe of humanity. Though I cannot bring myself to return to you countless stories that I have heard, I will instead share with you the memory of the title of an article in Time magazine that was published at the height of genocide and raid. There are no more devils in hell. They are all in Rwanda. History was made in Rwanda. Unlike any other atrocities before it, the genocide against the Tutsi came to us in real time through the mass media. Photographers and journalists transmitted live telecasts of men, women, and children being intercepted, bludgeoned, and hacked to death. They beamed into our homes and into our lives, the screams of fleeing, the trapped, the raped, the wounded, and the dying. We all witnessed the movement, the impunity, and the savagery of a dying nation gone mad. Then there were the plethora of newspapers and magazines, the radio, the telephone, and the internet. There were also tales of horror from countless survivors. Needless to say, there was the mounting body count that washed up on the northern shores of Lake Victoria. In our age of information, it is safe for us to say today that indeed the whole world was at that place, that deep dark abyss on the very fringe of humanity in Rwanda, and we're all still in that place. The world and its UN organs stood by and waited with food, shelter, and medicine in hand for the traditionally anticipated flood of Rwandan refugees to flee across the borders into neighboring countries. And when this did not happen, the assumption in various national offices was that there was no genocide, but an exaggerated media account of a low-grade civil war. What was poorly understood was that because of the integral involvement of the population, the most vulnerable Rwandans, the Tutsi, were clustered together, awaiting salvation deep inside Rwanda. Those who dared to attempt the journey to the border had to contend with the genocide of population, few ever made it to safety. Foreign embassies and high commissions evacuated their nationals to safety and closed their missions, most of them leaving their local staff behind to die. 10 Belgian soldiers needlessly lost their lives. Then the UN withdrew most of its effective deterrent military forces, and its commanding officer, who was amongst those who refused to leave Tutsis behind, and later lost his mind. Troops from DRC joined forces with the former Rwandan government, but found themselves engaged in a conflict which they had little understanding. Time was of the essence. Mandatory decisive military action by the Rwandan Patriotic Front led to a rapid cessation of the extermination phase and the total liberation of Rwanda. Professor Mahamoud Mamdani records the words of a soldier in his book entitled When Victims Become Killers, which reads, when we captured Kigali, we thought we would face criminals in the state. Instead, we faced a criminal population. Underlying his statement was the realization that, though ordered by a minority of state functionaries, the slaughter was performed by hundreds of thousands of ordinary citizens, including judges, human rights activists, doctors, nurses, priests, teachers, friends, and spouses of the victims. The massive participation of the population in the Rwanda genocide is without documented historical precedent. Indeed, the very popularity of public participation is just what makes the genocide against the Tutsi so unthinkable. We must never forget the important fact that during the extermination stage in Rwanda, an environment of extreme civil disorder existed in tandem with the upheaval of war. This allowed for all manners of genocidal crime to be committed, for which the entire population of Hutu, Tutsi, and Twa and others was at risk. Civilians, militia, and military crimes, including murder, rape, robbery, and arson, to name but a few. And we owe it to mankind to keep alive the memory of the shared suffering of all those victims of disconnected wartime immoralities. At the end of the extermination phase, the genocide against the Tutsi, at the end of the extermination phase of the genocide against the Tutsi, the death toll was estimated to be between 800,000 and 1,500,000 of people. Running parallel to the liberation process was a massive exodus of refugees, the largest and fastest exodus in human history. Unlike refugees' flows in all other wars, the Rwandan exodus was not of a large number of individuals seeking safety, but a large-scale, century-directed tactical retreat by genocidal killers. This large, unprecedented convocation of mass murderers, intermingled with unwilling hostages, moved swiftly at a rate of 250,000 per day into a secure nourishing of the UNHCR, where it remains at this very day, and where they're still committing atrocities in the DRC. This brings us to the final stage of genocide, the stage for us to sit up and pay attention, the stage for us to take stock of events, to rethink our strategies, to focus on the welfare of our offsprings, and above all things, to reclaim our humanity. The denial is the final stage that always follows the human catastrophe. Denial is the most diplomatic stage of genocide. It is the calmest, it is the most academic, it is the most imaginative and the most eloquent, and yet in the same breath, it is by far the deadliest. Denial is indeed the surest indicator of the potential further genocidal massacres. All through history, the perpetrators of genocide dig up the mass graves, burn bodies, try to cover up the evidence, and intimidated the witnesses. All through history, they readily deny that they committed any crimes and often blame what happened on the victims. They block investigation of the crimes and continue to govern until driven out from power by force, whereupon they flee into exile and continue to pontificate. There they remain in exile and act with impunity unless they are captured and tried. In this regard, the anatomy of denial in the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda is no different from other past genocide, and anything different would not have been the traditional human genocidal norm. What does make Rwanda unique was the massive participation of all level of population in the atrocities. This fact alone seeds the entire population today with a countrywide register of perpetrators, witnesses, and survivors, all living in close proximity to one another. It comes as no surprise, therefore, that to date, there are about 200 reported cases in which survivors and witnesses have been killed over the past 15 years. The ongoing killing of people as a direct consequence of the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi is a matter of grave concern. What is disappointing is the lack of media and scholastic attention this receives. Denial is a phrase that requires academic fortitude, and judging by the high academic caliber of many of the perpetrators of genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda, you can be rest assured that there is no shortage of it. There is no shortage in scope of learning and in depth of learning. And with academic skill comes eloquent genocidal linguistic terminology. And two new terms come to the forefront in the aftermath of the extermination phase: revisionism and negationism. Let us for a moment try to grasp the concepts that underlie these two words. Historical revisionism may be legitimate or illegitimate. That which is legitimate is by definition the legitimate peer-reviewed scholastic correction of an existing body of historical knowledge. And indeed, whenever a new and indisputable body of evidence emerges, it is only right and fitting that appropriate corrections are made in literature. On the other hand, the revisionism that is legitimate and which concerns us here today is the illegitimate distortion or denial of the historical record such that selected events appear most acceptable, usually in favor of the criminal perpetrators and their associates. If the mode and manner of the historical revision constitutes denial of a historical crime, then the term negationism is sometimes used. You will understand, therefore, why, in the case of Rwanda, I may use one of the other term interchangeably with these. Revisionism is a far cry from propaganda. Propaganda appeals to the emotions and to the masses, both of which are spent forces at this point in time. Revisionism appeals to the intellect and to the intellectual thereof. It advances a point of view, and its offsprings are readily absorbed and appreciated by those who are not fully aware of the stage of affairs in Rwanda. Intellectuals from inside and outside Africa have a hard choice to make: to believe the verbal and written works of internationally based scholars and self-exiled Rwandan professionals, or the cacophony of apparently unintelligible voices from the center of Africa. And indeed, if Africa is perceived internationally to be a jungle continent crawling with illiterate, mindless savages, then the intellectual would say, surely these refined works from scholars of such a distinction must be true. The bulk of the presentation and publications that exist and continue to be generated are directed to portray the Tutsi as the primary aggressor and instigators of genocide against Tutsi in Rwanda, and the Hutu as the misjudged, distressed party. You will find the same thing happening with the genocide committed against the Jews, whereby they are portrayed to be the instigators of their own genocide. Others option equal the blame to both sides of Hutu and Tutsi conflict. And the favorite motive theory is the one of double genocide. This theory argues that the Hutu had such an overwhelming numerical, organizational, and military superiority that in order for forces of the Tutsi-led Rwandan patriotism to succeed, they would have needed to use exceptional forces in both magnitude and brutality in order to break the resolve of the Hutu population. And in so doing, they effectively carried out a genocide of their own. The theory concludes it was not possible to achieve victory otherwise. That being the case, both sides are to blame for the genocide and should share equal responsibility. Negationism, revisionism by denial of the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda is the true outcome of the seasoned revisionists. It is structured and scientific and characterized by several categories and subcategories that we may extrapolate from the works of Deborah Lapstadt, Michael Schimmer, and Alex Grobman. The first category, outright denial, rejects the very existence of genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda and relegates it to the status of a civil war. The second category, the deflective negationism, admits the existence of genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda, but channels the guilt for its perpetration in several distinctions, therefore creating several subcategories based on the target into which guilt is deflected. This may include historical argument, which, according to which the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda was the price paid by the Tutsi for the past atrocities and the subjugation of the Hutus. Conspiratorial arguments, according to which Uganda, Britain, and the US conspired to diminish French influence in Africa and create an Anglophone Tutsi supremacy in Central Africa. Defensive arguments, according to which the Tutsi, by the aggressive nature of actions, forced the Hutu to resort to legitimate measures of self-defense. The active arguments, according to which the disloyalty manifested by Tutsi toward the Rwandan government triggered a backlash against themselves. Vindictive arguments, in which Hutu extremists suggest that the Tutsi as a collective planned, provoked, and orchestrated the genocide against themselves. Environmental arguments, which highlight poverty, overpopulation, poor agricultural yields, against the background of illiteracy. And then there is multifactorial argument, which is any of the combination of all the possible arguments. The third category, selective negationism, which is a mixture of outright and deflective negationism, acknowledges that genocide occurred, but denies any participation of one or the other group in its perpetration. Its promoters typically rejects involvement of their own countries in the genocide against the Tutsi. Revisionists typically advance their views on the local, regional, and international stage by presenting forged documents as if they were genuine, by providing good reasons as to why genuine documents are not to be trusted, by deliberately misinterpreting and mistranslating Kinyarwanda into other languages, especially in the refugee camps in the Congo. They attend talk shows and conferences, they publish widely, they use the same vehicles that brought the horrors of genocide into our homes and into our lives. To add to the confusion, websites, movies, books, and scholastic dissertations have been written by supposedly credible authors. Now, a growing number of internet sites associated with Hutu extremist hate groups are popping up and disseminating aberrant information. Where in the past an individual was once limited to printing and distributing this information in a single small geographic location, Now, the same individual can broadcast thousands of messages of deceit across oceans and continents into homes, academic institutions, and corridors of immense power with no more than a click of a mouse, of a computer mouse. Right now, there is so much disinformation in the public domain that even the most discerning scholars and astute politician is easily confused and taken for a ride. What makes both the exile and the resident Rwandan revisionists so convincing and so dangerous is the fact that behind all this deception, they actually know the truth. Their modus operandi, as Mark Twain puts it, is get your facts first, and then you can distort them as you please. As for all the other non-Rwandan revisionists, from all walks of life, politicians, judges, academics, analysts, NGOs, and the list goes on, they all have two things in common: confidence and ignorance. There is, however, a special worrisome category of revisionists, the governmental revisionists. These governmental revisionists are national governments motivated by guilt. Either the guilt of active participation, directed or by proxy, which we fully understand, or the guilt of non-intervention, or even the occasional abstraction for which excuses abound. Saving face and maintaining the moral high ground is the prime motivation force behind the revisionists' approach to the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda. What is worrisome about the genocidal proactive government revisionists is the enormous international influence and available resources at their disposal, and the readiness and length to which they are prepared to go make the world believe them. Such is the fickle mixture of men where saving face is more important than saving lives. One of the most glaring examples of proactive state-supported revisionism culminated in the arrest in Germany of a senior female Rwandan government diplomat last year on November 9. This arrest was on the basis of an international warrant of arrest issued in 2006 by an aging independent French judge who has since retired. This warrant of arrest also targeted high-ranking Rwandan officials, including the current head of state of Rwanda, President Kagame. The world was asked to believe that this lady, a refined diplomat, had offered comfort, aid, and sustenance to a group of shady national terrorists of Rwanda Tutsi extraction, and that these terrorists, armed with a large Soviet-made surface-to-air SAM-16 missile, had whizzed into Kigali by day and waited amidst the military fortification of the Kigali International Airport for the return of the president of Habyarimana. When all quiet and all was dark, the terrorists peered into the dark night sky, singled out the presidential plane from amongst others, and shot it down. Then, abakradabra, they vanished in a puff of smoke. The world was expected to believe, and still is, that the genocide may never have taken place if this incident had not occurred. However, it suffices to say that you will need a lot more than just a good pair of eyes to decide who is who in the dark night sky, and you will need to be amongst the chosen few before you would ever know the detailed flight path of a president in an office. Adolf Hitler once said, and I quote, "We shall give a propaganda reason for starting the war, whether it is plausible or not. The victor will not be asked whether he told the truth." But then Hitler, just like his Hutu Rwandan padres, went on to lose the war. Today, the masterminders of genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda and their associates may delay, but cannot escape their obligation to explain their actions to the whole world. This is therefore no surprise that revisionists the world over take much comfort and delight in the fact that the French political decision to retract this arrest warrant is not forthcoming. They perch like virtues on the moral high ground and profess to the world, citing that a political decision to resolve this issue would amount to political interference, compromise the independence of the French judiciary, and mask what may well be the truth. Rwanda is probably in the throes of the Fashoda syndrome. The Fashoda syndrome has nothing to do with the well-being of Rwanda nation. It is the unofficial name given to a tendency within French foreign policy in Africa, which gives importance to the assertion of French influence in areas which may become susceptible to British influence. For you, connoisseur of fine history, if you draw a British line from Cape Town to Cairo and French line from Dakar to Djibouti, where the two lines intersect is the Fashoda, known as Koro, on the Nile in the Sudan. During the scramble for Africa, it was believed that whosoever would control Fashoda would control Africa. In 1898, the French Major Marshal locked up first the Fashoda with the exhausted ragtag army. A few months after, Field Marshal Horatio Herbert Kitchener of Imperial Majesty Royal Navy showed up, and the rest was history. Today, the choice between a predominantly Anglophone as opposed to French leadership in Rwanda is a bitter pill to swallow in French circles and sweet pill in the British circles and the Rwandan circles. Since Rwandans are not linguistically deprived, there's no need to swallow any pill. Rwanda is a Kinyarwanda-phone country, and the sooner the whole world appreciates that, the better it is for the resolve of this final stage of genocide. We must not forget our international friends, the nice, misguided, influential, bandwagon type of I love you revisionists. People with no inherent malice, but whose influence and unfiltered utterances over the mass media serves as a cannon fodder for the hardcore revisionists. These include some leading movie makers, academics, leading politicians and their spouses, lower-ranking embassy officials, tourists, relief workers, and a variety of expatriate workers, etc., etc. This group is big, very big. Sections within this group are fomented in promoting the notion that seems to suggest that genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda occurred because of the global warming. They cite a combination of widespread illiteracy, overwhelming poverty, poor agriculture yields, and overpopulation as the leading cause of genocide. This popular group needs your help, and once tamed, they actually may be very useful. There are revisionists in Europe and Africa whose duty is to do good, and yet whose words and practices have put a smile on Satan's face himself. Revisionism prompted by grief is an unfortunate aftermath of any tragedy, and people will always think of what life would have been if the tragedy had not occurred. Grief is a strong human emotion that briefly clouds the mind of even the most rational thinker, and only passage of time is its remedy. It is true that the extermination is almost over, but now, in this phase of denial, Rwanda is a country that still faces the risk of invasion from a predominantly Hutu Ram state in the Congo. This Ram state, housed within the security and sanctity of UN refugee camps, consists of former Rwandan government that presided over the genocide. The faithful foreign backers, the former Rwandan National Army, and the militia, along with an estimated mass population of 2 million. Both serving as human shield and recruit reservoir. The presence of this state coupled with the intransigence of government revisionists, is a constant reminder that the fight is not over, that the final stage of genocide is not over. Then there is the matter of legislation. Truth needs no law to mandate its acceptance, and the truth of genocide in Rwanda is clear to anyone who chooses to critically examine the recorded events, or to remember what they saw, or to remember what they did. And in any case, in this age of information, we were all in Rwanda to see for ourselves. Anti-revisionist laws are entirely different matter. Anti-revisionists and anti-hate speech laws exist in France, Belgium, Israel, Germany, Austria, and a few other countries. These laws prohibit the public revision or denial of Jewish history as it pertains to the Holocaust, and seeks to criminalize hate speech. Some of you here may have heard of David John Caldwell Irving. In November of 2005, Mr. Irving, the author of over 30 books, was arrested in Austria and charged with the speech crime of trivializing the Holocaust. He was denied bail and subsequently sentenced to 3 years of imprisonment. It matters not whether or not he had genuine academic point of view. What matters is that his views ran contrary to the views of those who suffered the most, contrary to the historical evidence and contrary to the written law. Such is the standard by which the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda must be measured. Therefore, local and international anti-revisionist legislation is both a matter of vital necessity and urgency. It is inspiring to know that legislation has been evaluated in Rwanda to deal with the Rwandan revisionists and negationists in the same manner. It is only right that the rest of the world follow and enact and enforce appropriate law that deal with the matter of Rwandan revisionists within their borders. It is, after all, our understanding that genocide committed against the Tutsi in Rwanda was indeed a crime against humanity, and therefore must be treated as such. Of course, we would expect the revisionists to say that the Rwandan government would like to suppress their versions of the truth by enacting laws, but in enacting laws, we must recognize the philosophy of Plato and accept that laws are partly formed for the sake of good men, in order to instruct them how they may live on friendly terms with one another, and partly for the sake of those who refuse to be instructed and whose spirit cannot be subdued, softened, or hindered from plunging into evil. Within Rwanda itself, where then do we draw the line to distinguish between freedom of speech and the concern for national security? Just how harmful are the unchecked waging tongues of the local population in public and private? How dangerous are the revisionist sentiments of the school teachers, the market vendors, and the perpetual drunkards? There will always be a healthy debate between those who feel that the right to free speech should be restricted with respect to hate speech and those who feel that the civil liberty of free speech of the individual should be upheld above all things. What makes culture diversity change into culture animosity? How provocative and dangerous is it for Rwandans to refer to themselves by their proud cultural roots as Hutu, Tutsi, and Twa? Some of these things are difficult to quantify, but we must recall that progression of events that eventually leads to genocide start with these exact problems. However, this only becomes a real problem when organizations take root. Post-genocide Rwanda has taken a bold step in ethnic classification has officially disappeared, and all Rwandans are again what they ostensibly once were, simply Rwandans. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I say this to you. The challenge to right the wrongs of the past and and to present, to discuss, to document, and to disseminate the history of Rwanda is the sole responsibility of the people of Rwanda and their friends. And it is precisely because of that challenge that we are gathered here tonight, or today. Excuse me. The visionist is armed with two powerful tools, his tongue and his pen. The spoken word is soon forgotten because what is not written is like water on a dark spark. The written words will not disappear. What the revisionist writes will not go away. Responding to each and every new imaginative concoction is death trap in itself. For every single reasonable response or countermeasure you try to make to a revisionist allegation, you will receive 10 new exciting fabrications. You will be pleased to know that we have 3 weapons in our armamentarium: our tongue, our pen, and the truth. The challenge is upon us all, especially on all Rwandans and their friends, to compile, document, and publish an accurate history of genocide. The same public platform and avenues of mass communication available to the most tireless revisionists are also available to us. The onus is upon us to use them diligently and daily, and the people of the world will listen and read. Soon we will join the voices of revisionists with the truth. We should all support the hearings and the readings more from our Rwandan authors, historians, and philosophers. Distinguished guests, and ladies and gentlemen, we commend Rwandan people for their efforts and the Rwandan government. The efforts by them and others like them will eventually succeed in bringing this genocidal phase of revisionism and negationism to its ultimate end, and will give Rwandans a home in the diaspora the encouragement, the directions, and perseverance to rally behind the nation's mantra of never again. I thank you all gathered here today for coming here and sharing the history, the struggle, and the aspiration of a nation once divided. And in final summation, in all that has been said, I will leave you with the words of Richard Cohen. The truth is the last victim of genocide. I thank you.
So thank you very much for a very powerful paper, but also thank you for your academic contribution, also for your courage and your strength. So thank you. Just on a personal, another note that I wanted to say, but I didn't say earlier, David Warren from the ADL is here. He helped, the ADL helped to put this whole event together. So David's here, so thank you. I don't want to change the subject, but I started this morning in New York City where I gave a talk on incitement to genocide in Iran and radical Islam, and I met a survivor from Vienna, a woman who was very powerful as well, talking about her experiences and now listening to this. And as you said, genocide has been around for a while. So, any questions or comments?
Yes, please.
Go first. Yeah, I was just thinking, you would know a great deal more about this. First of all, thank you for your inspiring talk and for your great courage and truth-telling. I was wondering, there doesn't seem to be any inherent conflict between freedom of expression and laws against revisionist falsehoods. Certainly in the West, it's very well established that slander and libel are illegal between individuals. It is a crime, or at least a tort, to say something maliciously untrue, that you know is untrue about someone. Couldn't this also be, as international law is established, the case between or among opinion leaders, that it is prosecutable to say something malicious that you know to be untrue, to falsify history in this way. I wouldn't see any kind of conflict between that kind of law and freedom of speech or freedom of expression.
Well, I will comment on that, since it's not a question. But there is actually a conflict, and it's being discussed at the UN. It's always being discussed at the UN and in Geneva, the human rights. And the United States actually is amongst those states that support freedom of speech. And they don't see anything wrong with someone, how do I say that? There is a freedom of speech, but there is also a way that people could be limited without so much as without taking their rights, if I can say that. Like for instance, there is a well-known Rwandan speaker. I will name him because we are still actually fighting to get him out of conferences. He's the hero behind Rwanda. And what he says might appear to be the truth, but it's not the truth. So when we approached the government, the US government, they told us that there is freedom of speech. Of course, they know that what he says is not the truth. And why we are fighting to get these laws enacted, especially because they are enacted, like for instance, when it comes to Holocaust, it's not allowed in Europe. But in the US, it's allowed, actually.
Yeah, what I'm saying is that I don't see, I know that there are problems and conflicts that you're facing, but I was just trying to say that I didn't think there was any inherent conflict whatsoever.
If I may, thank you. Now, if I may also, just an aside, I think to sort of support what you're saying, I think the United States has actually become a space, because of the freedom, First Amendment, where it's a place where people are creating and setting up websites that are disseminating